How are you, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Professor Joseph Frusci. I'm an adjunct assistant professor with the history department here. And I would just ask that you mute yourselves, and we will be taking questions in the chat. And should we select your question, you can also raise your hand as well, and we can unmute you, and you could ask your question. The idea for this would be an open forum, open this up to everyone that would like to speak, ask questions after we get through our discussion. With me, I have Professor John Dixon. Would you like to introduce yourself, Professor?
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for attending. One quick announcement, this discussion is being recorded, so feel free to turn off your videos if you don't want to appear in the recording. Our plan for the discussion is, our plan for the event is for to begin with some brief comments and thoughts for a few minutes, and then we'll try and reserve at least the second half of the hour for conversation about the questions raised in chat. And I'm going to get things going with what I think are some broad but hopefully suggestive remarks about how we might use this current presidential election season in 2020 to think about the past. And I'm coming at this actually from what sent me along this line was looking at the announcement for this event, which raised the idea that we are expecting 2020, the presidential election of 2020, to be an historic election. And I wondered what that meant. What does it mean to be an historic election? How do we imagine or judge which elections are historic, which are not? Can we know if an election is historic in advance? Or do we need hindsight? Is it only retroactively that we can start to think about whether an election is historic and why it is historic? And those questions pushed me in another direction, which was to think about whether we can leverage this election season in 2020 with all its unusual aspects to rethink American history, the history of democracy in America. In other words, does this election season in 2020 make us think about American history, particularly the history of democracy in America in a new way? So rather than using history to think about and understand this particular election, can we use this particular election to think more broadly about the long history of democracy and voting in America? And to get into that subject, I'm going to begin with something that Barack Obama said recently while he was campaigning with Joe Biden. He is speaking in Pennsylvania. And he looked back at the African-American turnout in 2008 when he was first elected as the first African-American president of the United States. So as a historical perspective, he was looking back at this clearly historic election, his own election, but a historic election for the nation. And he reminisced that the African-American turnout was the highest ever in a US presidential election that year in 2008. But then he pointed out it was still only 60%. And he asked what would happen. He actually said, we never tried. He used past tense. We never tried what it would look like if we had 80% voting or 90% voting. So that intrigued me. I thought, here's Obama looking back at 2008, looking back at the past in order to imagine a different future. And he's introducing ideas of contingency, the idea that things could be different, history could be different if people voted. He was also sort of introducing an idea of agency to try and encourage people to vote, particularly in that moment, African American and young voters to get out and vote, to feel powerful. But he did so by revisiting a previous election, 2008, from the perspective of the moment. We never tried, he said, what would have happened if we had got more people voting in that moment. So two things spring to mind when I think about that. On the one hand, Obama is reflecting on the past, quite specifically 2008, but he's also admitting a more general problem in modern US politics. And that problem is really for all that Americans think of themselves as being part of this great democratic experiment, for all that Americans celebrate this idea that the United States is a city on the hill, a model of democracy for the rest of the world, voter turnout in the United States is usually not that great. And I'm going to share with you one moment, if I can find it, I will share with you a page from a voter pamphlet that was put out in 1952 that made essentially the same point. One moment. Okay, hopefully that has come up there. This is a pamphlet from 1952. And in it, it's referring specifically to, a state election, but it's taking place at the same time as a national election. And it reads, "Be sure to vote." So it's encouraging voters to get out. And then it compares the percentage of voters that turn out in different countries, starting with Australia. And that's a somewhat false comparison, because in Australia, people are legally obliged to vote. They risk getting fined if they don't. So that 96% is a bit of an outlier, but otherwise you see running down the list, Great Britain, Sweden in the 80s, Western Germany, Canada, Israel in the 70s, and then the United States lagging behind with 51% voting in 1948. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this poster is its timing. It's issued in 1952, just after World War II is ended and the Cold War is just getting underway. And prominent scholars, especially I'm thinking here of Lewis Hartz, were starting to advance the idea that the United States in this post-World War II, early Cold War climate was exceptional. It was different to the rest of the world. And it was different because it had this innate commitment to liberal democratic ideals, what Lewis Hartz called the liberal tradition. So at this very moment, you have in the 1950s post-war historians promulgating these narratives about, and I will get rid of this pamphlet, these narratives about the United States' almost natural inclination to be democratic, to be liberal. And at the same time, you have these concerns being raised that voter turnout is very poor. And I'm interested in that tension, that problem of, on the one hand, a very public national sense that America is exceptionally democratic, and on the other hand, this concern about voter turnout, and actually when it comes down to practice, Americans historically don't turn out in particularly large numbers to vote. And I think it's worth thinking about how scholars in the 1950s, like Lewis Hartz, made the case that America was exceptionally democratic. Given everything that was going on in the Cold War, they did not want to give the impression that Americans were democratic or they'd learned democracy from Europe, because that would open up the potential that Americans might also learn to be communist or socialist from reading European ideas. So Hartz and other mid-20th century scholars put a great deal of emphasis on historic and environmental factors. So they explained that America was democratic because it did not have feudalism, because it had a frontier, because there was plenty of access to land, because there wasn't this entrenched aristocracy, because Americans were not split along class lines like Europeans, because Americans descended from Puritans and other religious and political refugees and so on. So they cited a lot of historical and environmental factors and essentially said Americans were almost without thinking democratically inclined. And at the same time, of course, they paid very little attention to all the disenfranchisement, the fact that many African Americans, most African Americans in the South still could not vote, even though they were American citizens until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But nevertheless, they managed to construct a conventional historical narrative that I think became very entrenched in the both academic and popular memory of American history. And I'll just try and skim through it, give an overview of what this narrative looks like. It's a very linear, progressive narrative of barriers to political participation, barriers to office holding, falling incrementally